Alright, so now that I've finally finished grad school, I can start applying for jobs. And the other day I found myself writing a job application essay that was quoting someone named Simone Weil. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Simone Weil, but I only discovered her recently. In fact, I haven't actually even finished this book yet. But I figured if I can quote her in job applications, I can probably make a quick video about her and introduce you to who she is, and if I need to make a follow-up video with the second half of the book's quotes, I'll do that. So the book I'm going to talk about today is called Waiting for God, and it is a collection of letters and essays that were actually confiscated by the Gestapo, but have found their way into translation, which is great. So to give you context for the quotes that I'm going to share, I'll tell you a little about her life. She was born in 1909 and promptly decided to do something a little unorthodox. She decided that she wanted to live like the lowest people in society around her. So when she heard that people on the front lines couldn't have sugar, she said, "I'm also not going to have sugar." And she was 5 years old. And later on, also young, she heard that the poor factory workers couldn't afford to give their kids socks. So she decided she was going to live without socks. And this trend continued throughout her life to the point where she was working on peasant farms and also working in factories and stuff alongside these people and living in their same conditions, despite coming from a tolerably well-off family. And this lifestyle actually took a toll on her and made her quite physically feeble and probably contributed to her dying at the young age of 34. And you might say this is because she had Christ's heart and was living out her Christian calling. But this all started when she was agnostic. She was born into an agnostic family and quickly decided that she didn't want anything to do with God. Not because she disliked him, but because she didn't think she could figure him out. In her words, she said, "As soon as I reached adolescence, I saw the problem of God as a problem the data of which could not be obtained here below. I decided that the only way of being sure not to reach the wrong solution, which seemed to me the greatest possible evil, was to leave it alone." So I guess her motto for God was, you can't fail if you don't try. So she just decided to not touch that problem and was going to be happily agnostic. And yet she was living out her love for others in this very potent way. But at some point she had a mystical experience, and that essentially converted her to Christianity. It happened while she was reading a poem by George Herbert, which I'll pop up on the screen for a little bit if you want to pause and read it. At this point, she had been living in constant emotional and physical pain, including migraines that never left her for a second, not even in her most joyous times. And she says, "In a moment of intense physical suffering, when I was forcing myself to feel love, but without desiring to give a name to that love, I felt, without being in any way prepared for it, for I had never read the mystical writers, a presence more personal, more certain, more real than that of a human being." And she makes a point to say that she had never read the mystical writers because if she had, she felt she would not have trusted this experience. Later on, she talks about how she thanks God that she had never read anyone who had a similar experience because that might have made her long to have one as well. And then when it occurred, she wouldn't have been able to trust it. But instead, she had no idea this was a thing, had never read anybody else's account, and had this potent mystical experience and therefore felt like she was more able to trust it. But despite her converting to Christianity due to this mystical experience, she refused to join the church. And in fact, a lot of these letters are actually written to a Catholic priest who wanted her to join the church and was a good friend of hers, but she just kept saying no, that she didn't feel comfortable, didn't feel like she should. And in fact, she said that if she felt God was telling her to join the church, she would have obeyed no matter what. But she didn't think he was. She says, "If it were conceivable that in obeying God one should bring about one's own damnation, while in disobeying him one could be saved, I would still choose the way of obedience. However, it seems to me that the will of God is that I should not enter the church at present." And she says that this is because even when she is closest to God through prayer and worship, she feels no less inhibited when it comes to joining the church. But she continues telling the priest friend that she is writing to, "I was filled with a very great joy when you said the thoughts I confided to you were not incompatible with allegiance to the church, and that in consequence I was not outside it in spirit. And this is a very warming sentiment for me because I've had a similar conversation where I didn't feel like my beliefs could possibly fit into the church, but people within the church have told me that they are absolutely okay. And that's a very comforting feeling to know that you don't have to be disingenuous to be a part of the church. Ah, I love it. But she speculates as to why God wouldn't want her in the church. And she thinks that it is because so much of humanity was submerged in materialism and therefore outside of the church. And that maybe God wants her and a few others to remain outside to more easily shepherd or witness to them. And for her own part, she says, I have an essential need to move among men of every class and complexion, mixing with them and sharing their life and outlook, so far, that is to say, as conscience allows, merging into the crowd and disappearing among them, so that she can better witness to them. So that's an interesting and maybe noble reason to not join the church, but she has other reasons as well. And one of them is that she kind of thinks she was in it already. She says, of course I knew quite well that my conception of life was Christian. That is why it never occurred to me that I could enter the Christian community. I had the idea that I was born inside. But to add dogma to this conception of life without being forced to do so by indisputable evidence would have seemed to me like a lack of honesty. So she feels like the dogma that the church often requires isn't worth the distance that would put between her and other people. And it is perhaps because of this that she says she doesn't actually love the church as much as most people do. She's fine with it and appreciates what it stands for, but doesn't have that love. She says quite kindly, I owe you the truth, at the risk of shocking you, and it gives me the greatest pain to shock you. I love God, Christ, and the Catholic faith as much as it is possible for so miserably inadequate a creature to love them. But I have not the slightest love for the church in the strict sense of the word, apart from its relation to all these things that I do love. I am capable of sympathizing with those who have this love, but I do not feel it. All that I can say is that if such a love constitutes a condition of spiritual progress, I desire that it may one day be granted to me. So she earnestly longs to have spiritual progress, but doesn't feel like the church as an institution is necessarily required for her to have that progress. But what is perhaps a more compelling reason for her not joining the church is that the church is a social organization. She says, what frightens me is the church as a social structure. I am afraid of the church patriotism existing in the Catholic circles. I fear to catch it. It is not that the church appears to me to be unworthy of inspiring such a feeling. It is because I do not want any feeling of such a kind in myself. So she fears the patriotism of the church, fearing that its social or political trajectory will sway and bias the congregation away from the truth. Now this hits a little close to home, but she gives an example from history, specifically the Crusades. She says, there were some saints who approved of the Crusades or the Inquisition. I cannot help thinking they were in the wrong. I cannot go against the light of conscience. I who am so far below them. I must admit that in this matter they were blinded by something very powerful. This something was the church seen as a social structure. If this social structure did them harm, what harm would it not do me, who am almost infinitely more feeble than they were? So she gives an example from the Crusades, but remember, she lived in World War II, so she can just as easily, and does, actually give the Nazis as another example. She says that it all lies in a fault with her, that she is too group-oriented and maybe too credulous. She says, I am aware of very strong gregarious tendencies in myself. My natural disposition is to be very easily influenced, too much influenced, and above all, by anything collective. I know that if at this moment I had before me a group of 20 young Germans singing Nazi songs in chorus, a part of my soul would instantly become Nazi. And she's a Jew saying this, so she sees in herself a fault of being too maybe trusting or too social. and is acting accordingly to do the right thing in light of that fault. And in fact, doing the right thing is what she stood for a lot, apparently. And in the introduction, the editor puts it this way. He says that searching, she believed, leads only to error. Obedience is the sole way to truth. Obedience is the sole way to truth, and seeking can lead you to error. And it's interesting because she sounds like a seeker through all of this, but she felt that she was obeying, and that's what she was doing when she was loving all these people so well. And the idea of just doing what you're supposed to do, as opposed to endlessly seeking and worrying if you're believing the right thing, is something that comes up a lot in George MacDonald's sermons and also his fiction. These are his unspoken sermons, and I picked out a passage in here that has him saying how easy it is to fall into the trap of endlessly debating theology and then not actually doing what you're supposed to. He gets a little fiery and says, "If you, who set yourselves to explain the theory of Christianity, had set yourselves instead to do the will of the Master, the one object for which the gospel was preached to you, how different would now be the condition of that portion of the world with which you come into contact? Had you given yourselves to the understanding of his word that you might do it, and not to the quarrying from it of material wherewith to buttress your systems, in many a heart by this time would the name of the Lord be loved, where now it remains unknown. Men, undeterred by your explanations of Christianity, would be saying to each other, as Moses said to himself when he saw the bush that burned with fire and was not consumed, 'I will now turn aside and see this great sight.' They would be drawing nigh to behold how these Christians loved one another, and how just and fair they were to every one that had to do with them. But instead, we just split theological hairs and condemn one another for them." Now, this is just one example. MacDonald says this thing a lot in different ways throughout his sermons, and I think it's very convicting for me because I've always been that seeker trying to figure things out, and I've not been a doer as much as I ought to be. But that's what the future is for. I think that is one of the areas that George MacDonald has continually been convicting me. Now, up to this point, we've been following a loose thread of thought throughout these different quotes, but I wanted to toss in a few extra ones that were unrelated to the previous ones. And one of these is talking about Weil's methods. The editor in the introduction says that essentially Weil is wanting to shock people into seeing the truths that they've known their whole life but have become too accustomed to. She says that the paradoxes on which Christianity is based are a scandal to common sense, but we have protected ourselves against them by turning them imperceptibly into platitudes. It is Simone Weil's method to revivify them by recreating them in all their pristine offensiveness. Now that might sound a little strange, but I think it's a valid tactic, and it's one that George MacDonald also uses a lot. By showing us things from a completely different perspective than we're used to seeing them, our eyes are opened to the truths again. And I haven't read any of Dorothy Sayers yet. I really want to, but I understand that's what she did as well. She did a radio play of Christ's life and used the common vernacular for the speaking in it as opposed to the King James Bible. And this freaked a lot of people out. They were offended and shocked. But a lot of people also heard the gospel in a way that they hadn't heard it before and saw it with fresh eyes because of that. Now, another thing that I thought was a good takeaway from Weil was her thoughts on doubt. She saw that there was a purpose for doubt, or that doubt was not always a bad thing, especially if it was through the genuine desire to seek the truth. She says, "For it seemed to me certain, and I still think so today, that one can never wrestle enough with God, if one does so out of pure regard for the truth. Christ likes us to prefer truth to him because before being Christ, he is truth. If one turns aside from him to go toward the truth, one will not go far before falling into his arms." And I think that's a great and comforting statement for someone who's had a lot of doubts and also found this to be true. And MacDonald echoes this in his unspoken sermons probably a few times, but specifically, he says it quite beautifully here, saying, "Doubts are the messengers of the living one to rouse the honest." Because I guess you can have no doubts, but also be dishonest with your faith. Doubts are the messengers of the living one to rouse the honest. They are the first knock at our door of things that are not yet, but have to be understood. I just think that's quite beautiful. Now, the final quote that I want to share with you from Weil is actually pertaining to learning and the joy of learning. And this is something that stood out to me as someone who is applying for teaching positions right now and who has seen the good and bad of mentorship. She talks about how you cannot really learn without joy. She says, "The intelligence can only be led by desire. For there to be desire, there must be pleasure and joy in the work. The intelligence only grows and bears fruit in joy. The joy of learning is as indispensable in study as breathing is in running. Where it is lacking, there are no real students, but only poor caricatures of apprentices who, at the end of their apprenticeship, will not even have a trade." Since intelligence can only grow in the presence of joy, it is up to us mentors and us teachers to instill a joy of learning in our pupils and mentees so that they can actually learn and grow. And I've seen this in both ways, like I mentioned before. I've been in a great mentorship environment and have grown inestimably from that. But I've also been in a horrible mentorship environment and have degraded inestimably from that. And I think a good mentor can make you both excited and able to learn things that you may not have had the inclination to before. And a bad mentor can make you unable to learn things that you probably had the inclination to learn before. So that's something for me to keep in mind as I'm applying for jobs. I got one quote out of this book, but as I was going through it again, I realized I could have gotten a couple more quotes for that application out of here. I could have just sent them this book. Anyway, until next time, see ya. Hey, Bob, do you like your little collar? Oh. My neighbor decided that he needed to free range his pit bulls again, and so they ended up mauling Paparazito. But it looks like he might make it.